Okay, good afternoon. For those of you who are joining on your computer, if you can hear me and see me, please give me a thumbs up. Okay, any more thumbs up? I see one person so far. If you can hear me and see me. Okay, um, so I think we're good to go with regard to technology. I know we have a couple people that are joining us via telephone, so I just want to welcome you all to today's live chat. I'm Dr. Frank Harris III, and I am one of the folks who created this program or these programs. Some of you are part of our Teaching Men of Color program. Others are part of our Supporting Men of Color program. Um, I just got a note saying there's no audio. Can you all hear me? If you can hear me, give me a thumbs up. Yeah, you shouldn't be able to talk. You should only be able to hear me. Okay, I think we're good. So I don't know. Maybe there was one issue there, but welcome everybody. So today, the way that the live chats work is I'll do a brief summary of the programs. Covering some concepts that are cross cutting across all of the programs, and then from there I will take questions. So what I encourage you to go ahead and start doing is using those of you who are joining via computer to go ahead and start to populate the chat window with questions while I'm doing the summary. Uh, for those that are joining on telephone, of course, I'll read the question before I actually respond to it, so you can actually hear, have understand what was being asked, and then we'll take questions and go until right up until the end, until just after 5 o'clock. I know we're starting a little bit late today, but that's what we'll do. So, without further ado, a couple of things that some of the concepts that we emphasize in our programs are first and foremost that with regard to teaching and supporting men of color, and I would even broaden that to students of color, that all faculty have the capability of doing so. You don't have to identify as a man of color. You don't have to identify as a person of color, but you do have to have some understanding and appreciation of their lived experiences in order to be able to support them effectively. We also talked about some of the external life pressures that men of color and community colleges often face that have some influence on their engagement and some success, and their success. So things like transportation challenges, um, having financial dependence, stressful life events. So, food and housing insecurities, racial gender stereotypes is something that we spent quite a bit of time discussing in all three programs. So, talking about some common messages about masculinity, about men of color, um, recognizing that many are often really the two most prevailing stereotypes for this group is an inscription. Actually, there's three: an ascription of intelligence, so an assumption that they're not smart, they're not capable of being successful in any type of academic context, that they're criminal or come from a criminalized background, and then the last one is that it's what we call pathologizing culture, that they come from families and communities that don't value education. We also spent a little bit of time talking about some of the theoretical foundations of the program. So, equity mindedness, talked a lot about that, talking about equity mindedness as really being a characteristic of educators and institutions. Um, Equity minded educators are cognizant and understanding of systemic inequities and understand that the systemic inequities are what would influence the success of students of color, recognizing that when students are not doing well, and when we see equity gaps, but that's not exclusively an issue of student underperformance, but it's actually also an indication of institutional underperformance as well. Equity-minded educators are also critical in reflecting about their own roles and responsibilities as educators, and engaging in some sense making about how their actions, the way they teach, the way they serve, the ways in which they make sense of the experiences of students of color. How does that have some influence? That has some influence on success. Spent quite a bit of time talking about the SEO model, the social ecological outcomes model. This is the model that had a lot of the rectangles and the areas that talked about relationships between constructs. This model was presented both in the teaching men of color program as well as in the supporting men of color program. It wasn't a part of the racial microaggressions program, but we talked a lot about that, and just trying to capture some of the salient sociological influences on the experiences of men of color in community colleges. So we talked about background defining factors, things like age, time status, citizenship status. We talked about societal factors. Spent quite a bit of time acknowledging and talking about the importance, the influence of social stereotypes about men of color, which I briefly touched upon a few minutes ago. Um, with regard to the factors that are situated within the institution, talked about the non-cognitive domain, which is actually, pardon me, is really more so situated within the individual. So talks about the interpersonal identities, self-efficacy, degree utility or perceptions of degree utility, I should say, intrinsic interest, their racial and gender identity. We talked about academic influences, which are situated in the academic domain of the model. So things like student faculty interaction, academic service usage, commitment to a course of study. The environmental domain is all the stuff that's taking place outside of the context of the institution, but that has a salient influence on their experiences and success in college. So these are the transportation concerns, the financial concerns, family responsibilities, employment, stressful life events. One thing I'd also like to point out is we typically think about factors that are situated in the environmental domain as being negative factors, and oftentimes they are. But there are also some factors that are uh, facilitative of men of color's engagement and success. So just for example, about having external validating agents, so friends, family members, perhaps employers who are conveying messages of validation and support, or who are helping the student to, providing support to the student that allows the student to actually go to school and participate in school. So it's not, we shouldn't always assume that the factors that are situated within the environmental domain are negative. I mean, oftentimes they are, but that's not an exclusive thing. Then we talk about the campus ethos domain. So this is the degree to which students feel like they have a sense of belonging within the campus. They feel as though that the campus racial gender climate is safe and welcoming and inclusive, that they have access to campus resources that are effective in providing the support that they need to be successful, and that there's a critical mass of internal validating agents. So faculty and staff who are conveying messages of support and providing support as well. We spent quite a bit of time also discussing some strategies. So strategies around relationship building, as well as strategies for supporting men of color and teaching men of color. So things like, having embracing anti-deficit perspectives and challenging negative and stereotypical and racially prejudiced perceptions about men of color, conveying authentic care by knowing their name, being fully present in conversations with them, being willing to engage with them outside of class on both academic and non-academic matters, being proactive and intrusive in our relationships with them. So not waiting for students to come to us when they need support, but being proactive in facilitating and providing support is one aspect of that. Positive messaging, which is very important. Um, hearing things like you belong here, you can do it, you can be successful, I'm proud of you. Praising and complimenting actual work that they've done that is aligned with their success is important as well. With regard to some of the support practices, teaching practices. So making sure we're using culturally relevant content in our courses for those of us who have teaching responsibilities with students. And there's a range of things that we can do in order to do that. So, at the most basic level is recognizing the intellectual contributions of diverse people who've made contributions to the fields in which we're teaching. Making sure we're connecting the content to themes and issues that are relevant into the lives, issues, and experiences of students. Featuring guest speakers or featuring speakers who share some identity or some shared background with our students as well. And the last one I'll point out here is uh, performance monitoring. So this is using early alert practices. So, for example, if we know that a student is struggling on some early assignments, that we're intervening, we're asking the student to come and talk with us, we're providing support, we're making sure that they're connected with the type of support services that they need in order to be successful in our classes and so forth. So that was kind of a quick overview there of the teaching program. Um, Picking it up on support practices that we talked about. So getting to know students. So this is for those of you who are working with students outside of the classroom context. So in student services, for example, in frontline support roles like in financial aid or admissions or enrollment, counseling and advising, so forth. So getting to know students on a personal level is something that is really good. So again, just like what we said with regard to the teaching program, so being able to know students, know their names, learn some things about them beyond the fact that they're a student at the institution is something that we want to do. To the extent possible, we want to disclose our own challenges and support. Excuse me, challenges and successes. We call this humanizing ourselves. So sharing of our information about our own backgrounds and our own journeys, so that students can see us and relate to us in an authentic way, connecting students with people and not services. So if we're making referrals, making sure that we're not just saying, hey, go to financial aid or hey, go to counseling, but let's get you connected with Dr. Harris in financial aid or Dr. Harris in counseling. And making sure that students understand that we're connecting it with a person who provides support, who provides service. And then, lastly, with regard to this particular program, is being intrusive and conveying positive messaging, which we talked a lot about already with regard to the teaching program. With regard to the microaggressions program, we talked about the influence of microaggressions. Um, we talked about how microaggressions. Actually, we spent some time defining what racial microaggressions are, which in many ways are best understood as subtle slights, put downs. Sometimes they're expressed behaviorally, but not always. But the key point with racial microaggressions is that they convey a sense of disregard, disinterest, lack of confidence, and so forth in people of color. And it in many ways erodes their self confidence, their sense of belonging. Leads to emotional exhaustion because microaggressions are something that's consistently experienced by students, by people of color, I should say, not just students in academic spaces. Same goes for faculty and those who provide, who work in the support service roles and so forth. We also spent a little bit of time talking about how microaggressions, in many ways, it's about not so much about what's said on the surface, but it's also about the underlying message that's communicated. So, wow, Frank, you're really smart, or wow, Frank, you're really articulate, when said in a way that's microaggressive, in many ways it's saying, Frank, you're smarter and more articulate than I would expect someone like you or someone who looks like you to be. And then, talked about the different types of microaggressions, micro assaults, which are best understood as kind of not really microaggressions, but old fashioned kind of racism. So racial epithets, saying things that are very transparent and explicit when it comes to race. But there's also micro insults, which insult someone. So we say things that's insulting, or micro invalidations, which says to someone that they don't belong, they're not worthy, or that their experiences are not valid. And then, spend quite a bit of time talking about the different types of microaggressions. So things like ascription of intelligence, second-class citizens, pathologizing culture, assumption of criminality, color blindness, and quite a few others. So that is a very, very broad overview of the 3 programs that we have represented today. And then what I would like to do, or what I'm going to do now, is transition into the question and answer period of the live chat. And then I see that you all have already started to populate. Well, there are a few questions here. So I appreciate you all doing that. And we'll take questions until we run out of time. So first question, it seems like some of the microaggressions come from a well-meaning internal mindset of we're all alike. What are better internal instructions with which to navigate interpersonal relationships? Yeah, I would say that's kind of what's tricky about microaggressions is oftentimes I should say, when we microaggress someone, we're usually not aware that that's what we're doing, for starters. And sometimes we microaggress someone when we're intending to be kind and nice and complimentary. And so part of what we have to understand is that microaggressions are in many ways the manifestations of our implicit biases, of our unconscious bias. And so, what we have to do, or what we have a responsibility to do, is first and foremost is make our blind spots, or make our unconscious biases. We need to become more aware of them. So things like taking the implicit association test is a good starting point. So if that's something anyone's interested in, you can Google Project Implicit, and it'll take you to a web page where there's a battery of different tests you can take that can tell you, do you have a more favorable or less favorable perception of people of color, of women, people with disabilities. I mean, there's probably a good dozen or so different association tests that you can take. And that's kind of a starting point to make some of your unconscious biases, just so that you become more aware of them. Readings, trainings, professional development on implicit bias or unconscious bias and microaggressions helps as well. But I think part of what we have as a responsibility as educators is to kind of understand what are the most common types of microaggressions that people of color experience in education, and then which will enable us to be more conscious, be more aware, and less likely to microaggress someone, even when our intentions are not to do so. But good question. Thanks. Great way to get the conversation started. Okay, next question. Looks like we have 2 here, so I'll start with the first one. The training set of implicit assumption, IAT, the implicit association test, reinforces one association in a certain way and then gives the conflicting data set. What if we started the other way around? Would scores improve? I'm thinking implicit bias results could be more dependent on the order at which one is expected to do a particular training set. Perhaps so. One thing we know about the implicit association tests, well, first of all, there's some challenges with it. One of the biggest challenges is that it's really based on relationships between Black and white individuals, right? And so that's one challenge. And part of the reason why that's challenging is that we live in an incredibly diverse and multicultural society, and there are a lot more. There's a lot more representation, than Black and white individuals on college campuses. Sorry, I'm delaying. I'm sorry, I'm getting a little bit of a delay here in the feed. The second challenge with the implicit association tests is that concepts are often presented in a binary fashion. So black, white, um, you know, man, woman. Okay, hopefully we're still there. But the, the last point I was making was that the second challenge with the implicit association test is that it presents the concepts, these identity constructs, in a very binary way. So I think all of that has some influence on how we respond, at least to the test, and obviously has some influence on the corresponding results that we get. But yeah, change a particular order. That might result in a different a different set of outcomes. Second question: do economic factors impact unconscious bias? I'm thinking if there are societal factors such as economy which contribute to having more or less instance of unconscious bias in schools. I think there's a range of factors. I would say a constellation, an intersection of societal factors that influence unconscious bias. It's not just race. Obviously, I think socioeconomic status. I think economic factors. I think the political context. The political context plays a role as well. So certainly, the issue is highly contextual and highly nuanced in many respects. Okay, second, is there a study? Next question, pardon me. Is there a study that shows level of unconscious bias on areas low income versus middle income versus high income families in areas of the U.S.? My guess would be that there is such a study. However, I haven't come across any, but I would I would venture to guess that I'd be surprised if they weren't someone who's kind of looked at the intersection of socioeconomic status or income on the level of unconscious bias. And then also, I would say related to that, if we think about, income, in low income communities versus, for example, versus middle income communities, I think there's probably some correlation with racial diversity within those communities as well, which has some influence on the level of exposure that one, or the number of opportunities that one has to interact with people who are culturally different from them. And we know that experience, our unconscious bias is certainly rooted in our experiences as well. So I think it's all, in many ways related in some respects. Okay, next question. Equity minded in education. How do you feel if I ask a man of color representative to speak in my class to our students? Well, I think I kind of need to know a little bit more about the context of that invitation. So, for example, are you teaching biology class and you brought in a biologist who happens to identify as a man of color because there's some shared background with your students, inviting him to talk about biology, the work that he does as a biologist, for example, or a range of things perhaps related to his identity, his salient identities in biology. I don't necessarily see a problem with that, but again, I don't know if that's what you're asking, but I would invite you to pose another question and provide some clarity so I can make sure I'm responding to the question that you're asking. All right. Does the men of color have conferences does the men of color have conferences this term or next fall for students to participate? Is there a mentor program that I can take to assist my students of color? So there are two conferences that I would recommend that are great conferences that are great not only for students but also for professionals. So professional educators, faculty, staff, counselors. And I'm going to type a note, but it would be Black, Brown, and College Bound, which is done by Hillsborough Community College in Florida. The other that I would recommend would be the Amen Conference, which is in Los Angeles in March. So if you just Google both of those, you should find some information on both. But those are two excellent conferences that I would highly suggest. Okay, next question. I'm not a man of color. How would you feel if I attended a club, men of color? Do you think it would help students connect? If they knew I was a part for their benefit, or do you think it would be a challenge as I'm not a man of color? So I know that we have a lot of colleagues who are not men of color who do a lot of work to support men of color. So, white colleagues who are women, the full range of identities. And so I don't, I think that's great. I don't see a problem with that as long as, you're engaged in the work in an authentic way. You're allowing the men of color, you're sort of allowing the men of color to still have the space that they need. You're allowing the men of color to have the space that they need in order to process and make sense of their lived experiences as men of color. And you're truly there to support them as an ally. I think that's wonderful. I think we need more of that on our campuses. With regard to attending their club meetings, I guess I would have to know a little bit more about the nature of the club, the mission and purpose of the club. Is it a space that's designed for men of color to, build community with each other, to get support with each other and for each other? I would need to know more about that. So I would say on the surface, I don't see a problem with it at all. Obviously, if this is something you want to do it in consultation with the students. So, before you join or before you start anything, I always think oftentimes what I've seen situations where the students, the men of color, will start a club or want to start a club, and they'll invite a faculty member, they'll invite an educator to serve as the club advisor, or something like that. Obviously, I mean, that, if they invite you to do it, then, we can reasonably believe that your presence is welcome in that space. So there's a lot of nuance to this question, but on the surface, I don't see a challenge with it at all. How can a university determine if there are unconscious bias present on campus? Um, I think we should all assume that we have unconscious biases, and we all do. Um, it's just a manifestation of our experiences. We all have blind spots. We all have things that we're conscious and aware of. We all have things that we say and do that we're not aware of. Um, so I don't think it's so much about the university doing an assessment of unconscious bias, because any expert anyone who studies and has done any writing on unconscious bias will tell you that it is ever present. I think we have a responsibility as educators to recognize what it is, our own biases, to make what's unconscious more conscious so we can be more proactive in addressing those things. Um, okay. And then I would also say this with regard to unconscious bias. I do, obviously, I do some work and some training on unconscious bias, and I know that I have, unconscious bias as well. I'm, come across things from time to time, things I didn't recognize in myself. So it's not about me being better, than someone else. I mean, we all have it because it's all a part of our experience as human beings living in a socially constructed, largely society that's socially constructed in many ways. It looks like that those are all the questions that I have so far. Definitely have more time, so I would encourage you all to ask more questions if you have them. I'm going to go ahead and invite you to do that. Okay, got a couple more. From my field of personality psychology, we all have the slogan: "All humans are like all other humans. All humans are like some other human. All humans are unique." Might respectfully trying to live cognizant of those two realities be better operating instructions? Um, uh, you know, Perhaps I would say this: we know that there's some things that are unique to the experiences of people of color in education and in society. Um, and so I don't think all humans, we're all human beings, we're all alike. I don't really subscribe to that perspective. I think as educators and as institutions, we have to be intentional in recognizing the realities of race on our campuses. We see those realities we see very tangible evidence of those realities having an influence on students' success. We see it in the student outcomes data we collect when it's disaggregated by race. We see it in qualitative data we collect from students when they describe their experiences as racial ethnic minorities, both on campus and in society. So, while I think that might work well for some, I don't necessarily think it works well for getting to the point of making campuses safe and welcoming and inclusive spaces for people of color. And that's just my perspective, but I understand that there's others who might see it otherwise. Okay, I think there needs to be a deeper way to connect one another beyond the physical appearances. For example, connecting with each other's upbringing and life experiences. There an improper way to approach the issue in an academic setting? Yeah, I'm sure that there's some improper ways to do that. What we often say is you want to try to build opportunities for students to share their lived experiences. So things that are not obvious from their physical appearances, like their upbringing, like their interests, like their hobbies, like their learning styles. I mean, there's a lot that we can identify and in some ways leverage as educators to support the success of students. So some things that we often suggest, and this is not going to be feasible for everyone in every course in every situation, but starting with trying to have at least one short one-on-one meeting with every student in your class within the first couple of weeks of the semester. So they need not be very long meetings. We're talking, 3 to 5 minutes. Maybe you give students some prompts or some questions because they may be nervous, or may feel that that there might not be an opportunity to connect with you or build rapport with you. So some things like, what are some of the best ways that you learn? How can I facilitate your learning in this class? Are there some things that you're experiencing that I should know that'll help me better support your learning and success in this course? Hobbies, books. I mean, there's a lot of different things that you can ask about. And I would also say be willing to exchange, those same things with students. So inviting them to share those things about themselves, but also being willing to share those same things about yourself. And that's where we start to be able to create and form relationships and build rapport with students that exist and goes beyond I'm black, you're white, and that sort of thing. That really, it's ultimately where relationships are formed. I think the other thing is being willing to talk with students, to engage with students outside of the class. So, those informal encounters, when you're on your way to the parking lot or you're on your way to your office and you happen to run into a student, take a few minutes to talk to them, ask how they're doing. Um, has nothing to do with your class, perhaps, but students really appreciate that, and students really see that as an indication of you as the educator actually caring about them. And we know that feeling noticed, feeling valued, feeling cared about it's a very important element of the human condition. It's up there with, part of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And when we feel that way, we feel safe. We feel like we belong within a particular place. And then when we feel safe and we feel belonging, then we're much more likely to pursue challenges, right? And I think that that's part of what we need. I wouldn't say that that's the absolute core of what we need to get to, but that ultimately needs to be our goal as educators. Wonderful question. I really appreciate it. Any other questions? Okay. Well, if there are no other questions, I want to thank you all for participating not only in the program that you're enrolled in, but also for participating in the live chat, for asking very thoughtful questions. Being able to respond to questions that are well constructed and well thought really is the key to having a successful live chat. And I feel like we were able to have a good dialogue here today. I also hope you all will join the live chat on Friday. That one will start at 4 p.m. And Dr. Sim Barnharm, who's a professor, English professor at San Diego Mesa College, is going to be leading that discussion. So if I don't have the opportunity to see you all in person at a conference or perhaps on your campus, I wish you all a very successful rest of the semester and thank you again for your participation and support.